Hi, and welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange MacCabe, CEO and co-founder of Intuitive Performance. I'm a performance coach, HR professional, whole person leadership facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. And welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm Ange MacCabe, CEO and co-founder of Intuitive Performance. I am a performance coach, HR professional, facilitator, and your host. The Human Side of Business podcast is fueled by the genuine curiosity to understand how personal characteristics and skills can be leveraged to drive individual and team performance, tangible outcomes, and ultimately organizational success within business. Each podcast is devoted to sharing knowledge, expanding our learning edges, and exploring the trends in corporate culture towards growing the emotional intelligence of organizations. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm your host, Ange MacCabe. And today we're diving into a big leadership myth that we keep running into a lot lately. Hey, Maria. Essentially, that tough conversation, whether it's giving feedback, addressing performance, or course correcting, should be handled by HR or totally avoided. But here's a spoiler alert. They should not.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
I'm joined by my returning guest and intuitive consultant, Maria, to talk about why difficult conversations are your job as a leader, not HR's, and how you can start getting comfortable with them. Maria, welcome back.
Thank you. I love this topic because we see it all the time. So much so it's part of it's a module in our offerings that we do with our groups. So
valid point. Courageous conversations.
So a leader knows they need to address something with their team, but instead of handling it directly, they either avoid it or call HR. And what we see time and time again is it being a big missed opportunity to build trust.
It really is. And I get it. Of course, there's fear of saying the wrong thing that's out there, especially right now. We don't want to make things worse.
Right. Yeah.
Especially as leaders, we're not waking up like, hey, how can I be an asshole today?
Totally.
Like, that's my favorite kind of tagline, I guess. Nor do we want to damage a relationship.
Yeah.
However, the reality is giving feedback and having those tough conversations, or I don't even want to say tough conversations.
No.
Critical conversations is a part of leadership. And you just can't delegate it away or avoid it.
Totally. I think that's important. I think we'll use the term difficult conversations, but I think knowing that as we move through the content today, the hope is that it feels less and less difficult.
Yes.
Because it shouldn't be as difficult as it is, I think. Yeah.
Very much so. Great way to set the stage. Now, I want to be clear. HR does have an important role.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
However, their job isn't to have every uncomfortable conversation for us as leaders, right? So when we think about HR, and I do not want to mitigate the role of HR, but rather just identify its importance when it comes to difficult conversations with employees, is we're leaning into our HR practitioners or professionals around things like policy enforcement and how to navigate that. Yeah. Because sometimes there's gray areas.
Totally.
Or serious issues like harassment and investigations are required. Or something that's egregious to the human rights code, labor code, that type of stuff. When we're talking about daily feedback and team dynamics and culture, or even having a quick touch point about behavior. And oftentimes it has to do with miscommunication, expectations not aligning, et cetera, et cetera. This is where the leader has an opportunity to create a win with their team member.
Yeah, totally. So you answered part of my question, which was, what are the most common types of difficult conversations?
I have a list.
Oh, beautiful.
I feel like you're doing this to me on purpose.
Yeah. Let's hear it.
Everyone, Maria gives me the list now so that I don't make fun of her, just so you know. So the list is, there's things like the obvious performance issue.
Right.
Behavioral or interpersonal issues. And when I say interpersonal issues, it's like, are you fitting with the role?
Right.
Behaviorally.
Right.
Are you fitting with the team? Are you fitting with the organization and your leader? What does that look like? There's also feedback and course correcting, which we're going to talk a lot more about here shortly. Conflict between team members. And when I say conflict, it could be anywheres on the spectrum of just simply not communicating as best as we can, all the way up to what we believe conflict to be.
Right. Yeah.
Termination or role changes.
Yeah.
Again, there's HR proponents of this. However, it's understanding that as a leader, especially in biotech, where it's explicitly changing, week after week, those are things that you need to, I wouldn't say get comfortable with, but rather be able to navigate with confidence. Then there's personal issues impacting work.
Yeah, which is a big reality. The past always has been, arguably, but I think we've gotten more realistic about that since the dawn of COVID.
Very much so. I mean, in all honesty, what we believe here at Intuitive Performance is you can't separate the business Ange from the personal Ange.
No.
It's just not feasible. Then there's also unmet expectations or broken commitments.
I feel like that's a big one. I feel like that's a big...
It is. It is. And, I have a story, but I'll wait to tell my story.
Okay.
Don't let me forget about the story.
Story.
Then there's boundaries and workload management, which is another huge thing, especially in fast-paced organizations. So,
okay, let's talk about why leaders pass these conversations off in the first place. So what's getting in the way, do you feel?
Very much so. I think at its core, it comes down to basic neuroscience.
Basic. Basically, it's just neuroscience.
It's the fight, flight, freeze.
Yes.
But ultimately, it's discomfort.
Totally.
There isn't one person, I think, that I've met anyways in leadership that has told me, I like conflict, Another is the fear now of saying the wrong thing, being taken the wrong way, hurting someone's feelings. And I'm using air quotes.
Yes.
You can't see, because there's a big difference between hurting someone's feelings and providing effective feedback or making the workplace tense. We don't want to rock the boat.
Totally. Yeah.
And I lean into small p politics.
Right.
Which makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And essentially, a lot of leaders just weren't trained. I think this is the largest one. Yeah. Human skills in leadership. We just weren't trained. How do we navigate? It's not just about managing conflict. It's how do we navigate it?
Yeah. How do you just know that it's okay, And I think the biggest one, like you said, is most of us just aren't naturally great at giving feedback. And that's okay. And feeling uncomfortable is okay. But we can build that skill.
Yes.
And it's a skill like any skill that you can practice and get better at.
Very much so. What has been your learning moment in organizations where because you said, let me back it up. You said earlier, what I heard was a learned behavior and knowing that it's safe to do so. What was an event in any previous workplace or otherwise that there was this thing that happened that said that it was safe for you?
One thing as we're chatting that's coming up for me is I realize how different what we're calling difficult conversations felt when I was an HR manager versus currently with coaching clients.
I see you. Tell us more though.
Yeah. So in my HR roles, I was able to lean into, like you said, that policy side. I was able to really separate the emotion from the situation. So if someone was getting emotional with me, I was still able to like bring it back to the fact that this is not reflective of your character. This is not reflective of who you are as a person.
Meaning
this
you?
Or
the other person?
The other person, yeah. This feedback that you're getting is out of simply, here's your job description. Are you meeting those expectations? And so that's why earlier maybe that unmet expectations piece came up for me, because I was finding in my previous HR roles that often these conversations came up around performance, and it was around there usually being a lack of clarity around maybe what the individual should be doing. Maybe a role had changed, but the role hadn't been updated in the past 5 years to reflect that. And so I found that with my HR hat, I was able to just lean into the technical pieces of the difficult conversation.
That's really interesting because I'm going the polar opposite way.
Right. And I think that makes sense because I'm feeling that with the coaching side of things.
But even when I was in HR.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I knew the rules. I wrote the rules.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I should say co-created, in all fairness. But I knew them through and through. Yeah. I understood it. I had the things that told me and validated I did good at my job as an HR practitioner. However, internally, there was this constant tension of there's a missing piece. There's a missing piece. There's a missing piece. Yeah. Like it was so repetitive. Like it literally drove me to start to ask questions of like, where am I going? What am I doing? What's my purpose? Because it just was not in alignment for me. And I didn't, at that point in time, I didn't know what it was. Yeah. But it's the fact that I naturally leaned into wanting to build leaders with that coach approach, with levels of empathy, again, not, being sympathetic, but rather understanding. Yeah. And wanting to move forward. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I found with the more traditional HR roles, I didn't struggle facilitating or having difficult conversations because it was so formulaic in a way. But then what I've noticed with coaching managers who need to be having these difficult conversations, they don't necessarily have the HR framework or frameworks or that policy lens to kind of back it up. So it's kind of been taken down to this like just human to human level, which as you're saying, nobody wants to be the bad guy. Nobody wants to rock the boat. Right. So we just went down a whole rabbit hole and it's great. But
what I love about this though is that it's a bit of storytelling.
Totally.
By way of experiences and how it aligns with leadership. And again, I was going in a different direction than you were.
Interesting.
At the first of my HR career, I felt that I had to put on armor.
So it felt unnatural.
It felt so unnatural. I had to put on armor so I could operate black or white. There was no gray. It could have been culture. I mean, keep in mind, there's, a plethora of things that created that special sauce. Sure. But knowing what I know now and later in life in the HR side of things was that even in HR, there's an opportunity to add that human-centric approach, which is, I believe, in my heart's heart, is where HR or people and culture are now going. But it should have happened a long time ago.
I think maybe that's what I'm getting at. I guess I would say for me, to answer your question, I think I'm naturally very warm and empathetic. And so for me in the HR roles, I was actually able to lean into those black and white things as a support rather than like a limiting. It was complementary to, I think, how warm and empathetic I can be. Right. I was able to kind of harness it in a way that felt like a resource to kind of keep boundaries and guide the conversation.
One thing that's coming up for me, a lesson that I wish I would have had back then, regardless if I was wearing my leadership hat or my HR hat at that point in time, is that you can't or you shouldn't separate HR policies, because that is operations, from the human side of your business.
Totally.
And what's coming up for me is that some HR people or leaders organically understand how to integrate the two, but most don't.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for me, it took me a while.
Mm-hmm.
It took me, probably 2 to 3 years, I would say.
Yeah.
In HR leadership to really wrap my head around the fact that, okay, I need to understand that programs and policies are in place for consistent behaviors or consistent use. However, you still need to bring that human-centric side, i.e., conversations, curiosity, lack of judgment, empathy, all of those things to be able to help people move forward.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Sorry.
So let's go a bit deeper into HR's role versus leadership's role.
Good job bringing me back. So diplomatic. I really do believe that it's important, especially in this instance, where to break down where HR should be involved versus where the leader should take the lion's share.
Yeah.
And take the lead, essentially. So let's say we have an employee who's consistently late to meetings or not meeting expectations.
Right.
That's on you as a leader to address directly, right?
Right. Yeah. So you don't need HR to sit in on a conversation about someone missing deadlines, but if the same person has a pattern of like serious misconduct, then of course HR would need to be looped in.
Absolutely. Or if it's trending.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I also think that your HR peeps should be more so thought of as a partner.
I love that.
And brought along throughout conversations so that they can also share their expertise as to when they can jump in and help out and what they can do to assist you in solving those problems, right? And this allows for leaders to be a bit more empowered as to owning their part or being accountable for their portion of coaching their teams, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So maybe now we'll come at it from mindset. So how should leaders start seeing difficult conversations like feedback as a leadership skill instead of something like an action or a task to dread?
Yeah, I know that one of the biggest shifts is really realizing that feedback isn't about criticizing.
Yeah.
When you start using words like you did that, or why did you do that, or you're insinuating a negative outcome, or even overzealous, that's criticizing.
Yeah.
Right? That it's about you're making it about the person.
Yes.
Not the thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Conversely, when you flip the script and you ask a question like, hey, how did you arrive at that decision? That's seeking to understand.
Yeah.
Then providing constructive criticism is, avoiding, I should say, we've always done it this way. Avoid that, please.
Yeah.
But do say something to the effect of, I have no idea why I just did that, but do say something to the effect of like, with regard to this task, you might be able to save time by XYZ.
Yeah.
Or with regards to this thing, you're more than likely going to get a better outcome if you do ABC. Right?
Totally.
I think it's also contextual in the sense of like, is this a hard and fast task?
Yeah.
Right? Like, are you typing something? Then yeah, it's very much black and white.
Yeah.
If it's relational with, a department, with a person, with a project manager, with a client, key stakeholder, that's a different conversation, I think, altogether.
Something's coming up for me in thinking about your list of like the different types of difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And I think about, I always in my HR roles gravitated toward this, looking at things from, I guess, maybe a questioning standpoint of what is this a symptom of? So I think
like
before
that.
you even engage with the individual, so if they're experiencing performance issues, if there's behavioral or interpersonal issues, if there's conflict between team members, or it's maybe boundaries and workload management, to me that's a symptom of something's not working.
Yes.
So that's even like a self-assessment that you could do on your own as their manager. You know, is this the way this individual's always behaved? No, then what do you know could be impacting that? So I think there's work to do even before you have any type of engagement with your teammate or team members, to just take a beat and say, okay, something's changed. This is a symptom of what?
What's coming up for me now is an example from a podcast I listened to, The Diary of the CEO, and cannot recall this gentleman's name that was being interviewed, but he's brilliant. He's in the tech arena, and his rule was be kind, not caring.
Yes.
And at first, my feathers were a little bit ruffled when I heard that statement. I was like, what do you mean? And I listened to it a few times because it really resonated. Caring is when you avoid saying things at the cost of someone's feelings. Pause and wait for a minute. Being kind or holding kindness for your team members is when you're helping them understand when they're winning and when they're not winning. Full stop. Like, he made it so simple to see that, like, as leaders, we're falling into the caring bucket if we're avoiding constructive feedback.
Because that's in the bucket of not wanting to hurt feelings or not being uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what I was getting at with my story earlier, is I believe that I'm a kind human being and a caring human being.
Very much so. Everyone, she brought me Gerber daisies today, which are my favorite. Just
because. Just because. They're my favorite too. I mean, that was part of it. Sorry, I'm being real now. It was equally for me as it was for you. But I think the structure, like some of the HR pieces, like we talked about policy, that was complementary to prop up my caring nature, to lean into the kind piece. So I was able to have difficult conversations still as my warm, welcoming, kind self, but it allowed me not to go into, I need to protect you, or I need to fix you, or if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's really interesting. It took me a few years to wrap my head around that, but when you're there, which is amazing. The other thing that was coming up for me is that it's not so much about catching the mistakes, but rather looking at it from the thought process of how can I help them succeed?
Yeah. Which sounds so simplistic, but
it's challenging to do sometimes.
It totally is,
right?
Because and I noticed that both of us are trying to, like,
who else is in the room with us?
Both of you. There's just one of you. It's not about catching people messing up.
Correct.
But I think part of the reason you and I are shying away from using the term HR in this conversation is because the classic old school view of HR maybe is that more like punitive, critical performance.
Throw the gauntlet down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When, it has evolved. So we'll acknowledge that. And like we've been saying, it is complementary. So,
and support it wholeheartedly, for sure.
And like we've talked about before, just making, like, learning opportunities, make feedback a normal part of your team culture, not just something that happens when things go wrong.
Yes. I was thinking that exact same thing.
So reframing, we're just going to have continuous feedback conversations. It's not
feedback loops.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Love it. The same thing was coming up for me because oftentimes when we're coaching groups of leaders, we also see the trends of, I don't really know what to talk about today or how to reflect on this particular topic that we're covering today because there's no issues in this area.
Yeah.
And that's like counterintuitive to what you've just said around having feedback loops and the learning culture. So yeah, my mind was going the exact same place, as well as another recent example came up, and it was around the perception of feedback.
Okay. Yeah.
That it had to be harsh because of how this particular person experienced it. So when we all think about, and HR folks out there listening today will understand start, stop, continue.
Yeah.
Oftentimes my definition of that is a start, stop, continue that you talk about systems.
Right.
Not people.
Right.
And you talk about it from a perspective of like a company lens. What should we start? What should we stop? What should we continue?
Yeah.
Or if a leader is asking for that feedback, that's generally in my mind or my world, that's generally how you would use that tool or technique, not for giving feedback to employees.
Yeah, because then that becomes a bit directive. Very
much so. It's totally authoritative.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And this particular individual actually had that experience. And so when we were talking about this topic in the group coaching cohort,
there it is.
Then that's when it kind of came to light that there's also a really important point to consider. As a leader, how you deliver things is going to provide a lasting impact to your team members.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying this to create fear or to allow people to shy away from it even further, but rather what this comes to for me is full circle is intentionality.
Yeah. Also recognizing that unless you've had your team from scratch, there are people coming at you with coming to your team with different workplace experiences.
Very much so.
So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts around like what can we do or what can managers and leaders do to kind of take a temperature check. But as I'm saying that out loud, it might be something as simple as saying, welcome to the team. We, part of our culture is continuous learning. We like to have all kinds of feedback conversations and just kind of front loading folks to know that that's how, rather than just like, you're in week one. Exactly. You're in week one of your new gig and you have a new feedback conversation in your calendar and you're like, oh my God.
I actually did that to someone.
Oh no. Just do my favorite thing, which is communicate preemptively.
Absolutely. Which I did do. In all fairness to me, I did do that. I think your point is extremely valid, Maria, in saying that you're preemptive in setting the culture of your team is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a thread that continues along, the journey of however long that employee is with you on your team.
Yeah.
Yes.
You got it.
100%.
Thank you.
So
yeah, you go for it.
That's okay. You go for it. What were you going to say?
Well, you were just giving a really good example.
Okay.
And I just really liked it because you were talking about we were just talking about how it doesn't need to be dramatic. And I think perhaps I'm hearing, that it's habit-based.
Yes, you're correct.
So what would you say about, or could you say more, I guess, about creating, or is there a habit to practice, or what is the skill to practice to build that?
All of them.
All of them.
No, in all seriousness, I feel like there's equal parts confidence building in the leader themselves.
Yeah.
So you need to really be able to find your mojo or your groove around feedback and having one-on-one conversations with your team members. I think there's the skill of intentionality, right? So when I go into a conversation with my team member, it's not just about what is their goal for the week, what are they doing, what are they going to accomplish for the company. You're also putting in flavors of what's working for you, what's not working for you. How can I help you? How is this going? And maybe even once a month having set aside time so that you're really sitting down to further understand what motivates your team member or doesn't motivate your team member. And that will automatically inform how you're going to provide feedback to your team member, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I think that when it comes to feedback, we only think about it from a formal perspective of performance management, whether that's done annually, quarterly, weekly, what have you, and not so much as like real-time moments.
Yeah. And like you said, framing it just from a positive standpoint, not performance management.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, again, going back to the neuroscience space, when we think about what we need by way of feedback statistics, and I'm going down another rabbit hole.
Yeah, do it.
I do this with my leadership groups all of the time, and I love it. It entertains me more than anybody else because I love seeing reactions.
Yeah.
And I'll ask the question to the groups, how much feedback do you think, like what's the ratio of feedback, good to bad for children? And we'll get some guesses, like 10 good, 1 bad, 8 good, 1 bad. The actual ratio, and I'll come back to the neuroscience piece, I'm just realizing that now, is 5 to 1.
Yes.
5 good pieces of feedback to 1 constructive feedback, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll ask the question, so do you think adults need more or less? What does that number look like? Oftentimes the responses will be lower. And in actuality, it's higher. It's 6 to 1, right?
Wow.
And the look on your face right now is the exact same look that I get from so many leaders because we don't think that positive or problem-solving feedback is something that's within our wheelhouse that we need to do. If you want team engagement, if you want retention, especially in competitive spaces like tech, biotech, life sciences, you need to intentionally have those conversations with your team members. And that's often missed. The other piece that came up for me around the neuroscience thing, my spacey brain just jumped. Space of everything really comes into play around when we are thinking about feedback. Our natural behaviors take us to the negative because of that archaic fight, flight, freeze.
And that it's going to be negative. Feedback equals negative.
Right. So, and this also backs into your original question, what about habits?
Yeah.
Right? So everything that I've just said, I'd encourage leaders to write it down because here's the thing. When you're able to understand what is needed to create a habit, you're going to get 4x from your team members. I'll say that again. When you're able to understand the habit patterns of your team and what they need, you're going to get 4x out of them.
So go back to they should write it down. What do you want them to write down?
Good question. So what I want them to write down are things like the 6 to 1 ratio.
Right.
6 positive. And again, you know, adding like a cursory note or context here that positive also means kind.
Right.
Right? 6 to 1 ratio. Then there's also the intentionality. So how am I bringing that into every single conversation that I'm having with my team or individuals? Common sense applied.
Yeah. So how do I integrate feedback related conversations consistently into the culture?
Absolutely.
From a place of positivity, not from a place of being critical. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So make it a culture priority, and until it becomes second nature to think in that way of 6 positives to 1 negative.
Right.
Write those positives down. And would you present the person with the positives that you've noticed about them throughout the week? Like if you had a weekly Friday, again, while you're developing that muscle.
Yeah, good question. Good question.
Is that a good way to practice? Would you say, I noticed, you did this. I'm asking this because with my parenting hat on, this is what I do with my daughter. Rather than like, you do this, you do that.
Right.
When I see her naturally doing it, I praise her for, or like point out.
Yes.
That's awesome.
In an authentic manner.
Exactly.
Because everybody has the bullshit meter, right?
For sure.
And also I would suggest, take from it what you will, not to save like a list, but rather one key moment, like the shimmer moment that we talk about in past episodes, this moment where you notice that that person has genuinely grown or put in the effort or failed and has learned or failed and has an opportunity to learn, even those things can be brought forward to be like, hey, Maria, I noticed that last time when it was really hard with this particular coach approach, you just kind of packed it in and called me up to have a conversation. This time around, I see that you're asking questions. Holy, like, you should be proud of that.
Yeah.
Something
Totally.
as simple as that.
Yeah.
Right?
So to form the habit, you would have your list of 6 just for you to kind of develop this muscle. But when you go to talk to the individual, you're not kind of reading the list of 6 things. You're kind of picking that. Okay.
Could you imagine?
That's a good...
Let's role play for a second.
It gives like a grocery list. It might not serve the authenticity piece so well.
No, you got it. You got it. Absolutely. And I mean, in some circumstances, it would be warranted. All jokes aside, like I'm giving you a hard time today on the podcast, but all jokes aside, there are some instances where the laundry list is warranted. In most instances, I would stay behind the fact that you pick one that's genuine, descriptive, and deliver it in a way that will be received by the recipient, your team member.
So one last tool I want to highlight that's been interesting is the SBI model. So situation, behavior, impact. It keeps it clear when there still has to be kind of a tone of maybe negativity. So it would be like in yesterday's team meeting, which is the situation.
Yep.
You interrupted a teammate multiple times, which is your behavior.
Sounds like you're talking to me.
Perhaps. And it shut down the conversation. That's the impact.
Yes.
So again, that helps you kind of stick to the facts. And that's been helpful. I've seen that be helpful when, again, there does need to be just a smidge of discomfort. So situation, behavior, and impact. You can still deliver it in like a warm, kind tone and make sure that you give space to have dialogue about it, not just like you book them for a 5-minute meeting. You do your SBI and then you're on to the next.
Absolutely.
Make it a dialogue.
And I would capitalize the impact, because oftentimes people do not understand or see or even realize the impact that they're having, as well as having the conversation around maybe in that instance, like in the first instance, it might not be the best time to identify action steps.
Yeah.
However, I think that's also important to add in there so that the team member is being accountable, essentially.
Yeah.
Because 9 times out of 10, when there's behaviors, to me, that equals habit formations needed. Yeah. And you're not going to have a habit if you don't have actions in play.
Yeah.
Now, with that said, I also strongly believe that it needs to be a collaborative conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
Not a dictative or directive conversation, unless, it's egregious or what have you. Right? And I do really like going back to just the SBI tool itself, Maria, because it gives you that pragmatic operational approach. And I'd like to add mindset.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's huge.
I'll give you an example. I know I had a boss, and it was my first job at a shoe store when I was 15. And every Monday I would know not to go to my manager about anything. It didn't matter if it had to do with a standard operating procedure of the store. I just would not go to them. Friday at 1 p.m., I would absolutely go to them. If I needed to switch a shift or, something came up or even if I had a question about certain things, because I knew that their mindset, I didn't know what I know now, but I knew that their mindset just wasn't good on Mondays.
Yep.
Leaders, I would honestly, all jokes aside, take that into strong consideration when you're having these conversations, which oftentimes we don't, right?
Yeah.
Just like parenting.
Totally.
When my son was 2 versus 12, I
Yeah.
parent totally different.
Absolutely.
When he was 2, it was more so of I parented him how I knew how to parent.
Yeah.
And now it's parenting him from a place of, if I'm not in a good frame of mind, I do not talk about anything deep or behavioral
Yeah. You're
changing.
assessing kind of both your needs. I
Very
think.
much so.
Yeah.
Again, caveats in the workplace, whether it's safety, egregiousness,
Right.
timing does matter.
Yeah.
For the most part, though, in the things that we're talking about right now with general feedback, it's keeping in mind, maybe someone got bad news about a family member that day and they were going into this meeting. Yeah. Vulnerability and authenticity is so key here, where it's like, you know what, like I scheduled this meeting to talk about XYZ.
Yeah.
We're not going to today.
Yeah.
I just found out about ABC.
Exactly.
I'm sure that person will take a sigh of relief.
Totally.
And,
Yeah.
everyone kind of has the gift of time. Context, again, is really important.
Yeah. And I think it's further to what you said earlier, where I may not use the exact words, but this is a chance to help someone grow.
Yes.
So again, not from oh my God, I'm going to ruin this person's day.
No.
But from this is a growth opportunity.
Yes. And as coaches, I think we take it for granted.
I agree. Yeah.
When it comes to the mindset pieces, because
that's everyone's mindset. Yeah.
And it's not. And so the epiphany that I just had, Maria, is it's as simple as this. Am I in a space today to help that person grow?
Oh, yes. Am I in a space today to help that person grow?
Right.
I love that.
And if your answer is no, then you don't.
And if it's perpetually no, then you probably should have a deeper reflection. Yeah.
You might need to talk to Coach Maria.
Yeah. So, okay. Final thoughts.
Okay.
If you're a leader listening to this today, I've been avoiding these conversations. What's one step you can take today?
I'd say start small.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not about accomplish everything at 100%.
I like the mindset one. That's my favorite.
I like that too. And I'd frame it like this. I think that picking one conversation or one thing is really important that maybe you've been putting off for a minute or two, and use the simple framework.
Yeah.
SBI plus mindset.
Exactly.
So basically, you really want to keep it from a perspective of, I want this person to learn and grow, mindset. Yeah. I want to make sure that it's clear.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that it's kind. And I'm willing to allow pause to see how the conversation goes with that team member.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
And remember that HR is still there. We're not saying it's a no-no.
100%.
But it's a support, or like you said earlier, they're your partner in this. But these kind of everyday conversations are your responsibility. And the more you lean into them, the more confident you'll become and the more trust you build with your team.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great point, Maria.
Thanks for having me, Ange. And to all the leaders out there, stop outsourcing your tough conversations. Listen to this episode and then just say to yourself, you've got this.
I love that. Great point.
You got it.
You got it. So that's it for today's episode of the Human Side of Business podcast. If you found this useful, share it with a fellow leader who needs to hear it. And as always, let's keep the conversation going. Reach out to us at Intuitive Performance on LinkedIn, or drop us a message with your thoughts. Until next time, keep leading with confidence.
Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. We're glad you could join us. Just a reminder, you can subscribe to future episodes at intuitiveperformance.com, where you can also sign up for webinars and learn more about our professional coaching and people and culture development services. Take good care. Thanks for listening to the Human Side of Business podcast. I'm glad you could join us. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay updated with our latest content, make sure to visit our website. The link can be found in the episode description, where you can subscribe to the podcast, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about our whole person leadership services. Sounds interesting? Explore the Whole Person Leadership Cohort by Intuitive Performance, a unique program that offers unparalleled support to managers on every step of their leadership journey. Our program features evidence-based assessments, workbooks, group coaching, and interactive learning experiences to help you level up your leadership skills. Reach out today to apply to one of our upcoming cohorts. Until next time, take care and stay curious.